She wasn't supposed to be there. And somehow, that's exactly why I couldn't look away. The first time Ethan Caldwell saw her, the sun was cutting across the surface of his private pool like shattered glass. Everything quiet, controlled, exactly the way he liked it, except for the one thing that didn't belong. A girl standing at the edge of the water, barefoot, still, like she had stepped into the wrong world and hadn't realized it yet. Her reflection trembling beneath her, as if even the water refused to accept her presence. And Ethan, a man who built billion-dollar decisions on instinct, felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not anger, not curiosity, something sharper, something older, like a memory trying to surface but stopping just short of being seen. She didn't turn when he approached, didn't flinch when his shadow crossed hers. And when she finally looked at him, it wasn't fear in her eyes, it wasn't awe either, it was recognition, quiet and certain, like she had been expecting him all along. And that was the first thing that made no sense because Ethan Caldwell was not a man people recognized without reason, especially not someone like her, dressed in a simple uniform, clearly staff, someone who should have avoided this area entirely, someone who should have been gone before he ever noticed. "You're not allowed here," he said, his voice calm but edged with authority, the kind that moved people without needing to rise. But she didn't move, didn't apologize, didn't even look surprised. Instead, she gave the smallest shake of her head, almost like she was correcting him without words. And that was the second thing that didn't make sense, because no one corrected Ethan Caldwell. Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang, a glass clinked, the world continuing like normal. But right there by the water, something had shifted, something quiet but irreversible, and Ethan felt it. The same way you feel a storm before it breaks, subtle, electric, impossible to ignore. Later that day, he asked for her name, a simple request, routine, something that usually returned answers in seconds. But this time, there was hesitation, confusion, and then nothing. No file, no employment record under that name, no background, no trace of how she even got past security, as if she had stepped into existence the moment he saw her and nowhere before. That was when curiosity turned into something else, something colder, more deliberate. He watched the security footage himself, frame by frame, and there she was again, entering through a staff corridor, head down, movements precise, like she knew exactly where she was going, like she had been there before, except the system showed no prior access, no entry logs, no history, just that one moment, like a glitch in a perfect system. By evening, Ethan told himself it didn't matter, that she was a mistake that would be corrected, a problem that would disappear the way all problems did under his control. But as the sun dropped and the pool lights flickered on, he found himself standing in the same place again, looking at the same water, waiting for something he couldn't explain, and when she didn't appear, it should have ended there, except it didn't, because the next morning, when the report finally came in, there was one line that refused to make sense, one detail that turned everything into something far more dangerous than a simple mistake. The girl had no past, no identity, nothing, except a single record tied to a child, a 5-year-old boy, living miles away, carrying a last name that Ethan Caldwell had spent years protecting, controlling, and never sharing with anyone who didn't belong to his world. Names do not lie, but people do, Ethan Caldwell said quietly as he stared at the report again, his fingers resting against the polished edge of his desk, the city stretching out below him in perfect lines of control and order, everything exactly where it should be except for one impossible detail that refused to fit. The child's last name matched his, not a common coincidence, not something that could be brushed aside, because Ethan had spent years ensuring that name stayed protected, sealed, within contracts, legal walls, and carefully managed history. Yet here it was, attached to a boy he had never seen, connected to a woman who technically did not exist. He leaned back slowly, replaying every second of the moment by the pool, the way she looked at him, not curious, not impressed, but certain, and that certainty now felt heavier, like it carried meaning he had not yet uncovered. "Find everything," he said, his voice calm but sharper now, directed at the head of his private security team standing across from him, a man who rarely failed and never questioned. "I want to know where she goes, who she speaks to, and how she got inside my property without leaving a trace." And within minutes, the quiet machinery of Ethan's world began moving. Cameras reviewed, staff questioned, access points analyzed. But the more they searched, the stranger it became, because the girl moved like she understood the system, not avoiding it, but flowing through it, appearing only where she needed to be and nowhere else, like someone who had studied every detail long before stepping foot inside. By late afternoon, a partial answer arrived. A small apartment located 20 miles away, modest, clean, nothing unusual except for the fact that it was rented under a different name, one that also led nowhere, another identity without history, another dead end. And yet the child was real, confirmed by school enrollment records. A 5-year-old boy attending a local elementary school, quiet, well-behaved, no disciplinary issues, described by his teacher as observant, almost too aware for his age. And that single description made Ethan pause longer than he expected, because awareness was not something children learned on their own. It was taught, shaped by environment, by experience. That evening, Ethan did something he had not planned to do, something that did not align with his usual calculated distance. He drove himself. No driver, no announcement, just a black car moving through streets that grew narrower and less controlled the farther he went, until the city no longer looked like something he owned, but something he had stepped into without permission. And when he reached the building, he did not go inside, not yet. Instead, he waited across the street, watching, observing, the same way he did before making any major decision. Patient, precise. The door finally opened just after sunset, and there she was again. The same girl from the pool, now dressed simply, her hair tied back, holding the hand of a small boy who looked up at her with complete trust. And Ethan felt that same unfamiliar tension return, sharper this time, because when the boy turned slightly, just enough for the streetlight to catch his face, there was something undeniably familiar, not identical, not obvious, but enough to make Ethan's breath slow, enough to make his certainty begin to crack. The girl knelt down to the child's level, speaking softly, her expression gentle in a way Ethan had not seen before. And for a brief moment, she smiled, not the guarded look she had given him, but something real, something unprotected. And that was when Ethan understood the most dangerous part of all of this was not the missing records or the impossible access or even the shared name. It was the fact that whatever truth connected them had been carefully hidden for years, and she had just walked back into his life like she had never left, except he had no memory of ever knowing her. And that meant one thing he could not ignore anymore. Either she was lying about who she was, or someone had gone to great lengths to erase the part of his life that included her. The truth does not disappear. It waits until you are ready to see it. Ethan Caldwell murmured under his breath as he remained in the car, his eyes fixed on the small scene across the street that felt far more significant than any boardroom decision he had ever made. Because for the first time in years, something was happening outside of his control. The girl stood up again, guiding the boy gently toward the building entrance, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder, and Ethan noticed the way she moved, careful, aware, always scanning, not with fear, but with intention, like someone who had learned to anticipate what might come next. And that detail stayed with him as the door closed behind them, leaving the street quiet again, leaving him alone with questions that refused to settle. He did not follow immediately, not because he lacked the ability, but because instinct told him this was not a situation to rush. This was something that had been building long before he became aware of it, something layered, deliberate, and possibly dangerous in ways he could not yet define. Instead, he returned home that night with a decision already forming, one that he rarely made without full information. He would not wait for answers to come to him. He would bring her back into his world where every variable could be observed, measured, understood. The next morning, the instructions were simple. The resort management was told to reassign schedules, adjust staffing, and ensure that the girl would be placed in direct proximity to areas Ethan frequently occupied. No alarms, no confrontation, just quiet repositioning, the kind that appeared accidental to anyone who did not know better. And by midday, it worked. She was there again, near the pool, arranging towels, her movements precise, her expression neutral, as if nothing unusual had happened. as if she had not been the center of a growing mystery that now consumed one of the most controlled minds in the city. Ethan approached this time without hesitation, his presence enough to shift the atmosphere around them, subtle but undeniable, and when she sensed him, she did not turn immediately, which told him she already knew he was there, confirming what he had begun to suspect, that very little about her was accidental. "You came back," he said, his tone even, but carrying a weight that demanded acknowledgement, and after a brief pause, she turned slowly, meeting his gaze again with that same unsettling calm recognition. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional. "I never left," she replied, her voice steady, soft but certain, and that answer landed deeper than he expected because it was not just a statement about location. It felt like something else, something layered beneath the words, something that suggested history rather than coincidence. Ethan studied her closely now, not just her face but the details, the way she held herself, the way her eyes did not wander or avoid, and the more he looked, the more he felt that same distant familiarity pressing at the edges of his memory, like a name he almost remembered but could not fully reach. "What is your name?" he asked again, not because he needed the answer, but because he wanted to hear how she would say it, and she hesitated this time, just for a second, just enough to matter, before answering. "Lily." And nothing more, no last name, no explanation, just a single word that hung between them like an unfinished sentence. Ethan nodded slowly, as if accepting it, but inside, everything sharpened, because hesitation was not random. It was a choice, and every choice she made seemed calculated in a way that pointed to something larger. Before he could speak again, a voice called out from across the deck, a manager reminding her of another task, and she stepped back, breaking the moment with quiet efficiency, returning to her role as if the conversation had never happened. But as she turned away, she said something so softly it almost blended into the sound of the water. "You should not be looking for answers you are not ready to remember." And Ethan stood there, completely still, because that was not a warning from a stranger. That was a statement from someone who knew exactly what he had forgotten. Memory is not something you lose. It is something someone takes from you. Ethan Caldwell said quietly to himself later that night, standing alone in his office as the city lights reflected across the glass walls, each one steady, predictable, unlike the growing uncertainty inside his own mind. Lily's words had not faded. They had settled, repeating with quiet persistence, forcing him to confront something he had spent years avoiding without even realizing it. Because Ethan did not forget things, he archived them, controlled them, built systems around them. And yet now there was a gap, not small, not insignificant, but precise, like a piece had been removed with intention, leaving everything else intact. He turned back to his desk and opened a secured file system, one that held personal records not accessible to anyone else, not even his closest executives, and began reviewing his own history, contracts, timelines, travel records, medical reports, anything that could indicate a disruption, a moment where something might have been altered or erased. And at first, everything appeared normal, consistent, exactly as expected, until he reached a period 5 years ago where the documentation became unusually minimal, not missing, but simplified, compressed into summaries rather than detailed entries, a subtle difference that most would overlook, but not him. "Expand this," he instructed, initiating deeper retrieval protocols, but the system returned a limited response, flagged as restricted under his own authorization from years prior. And that was when something shifted, because Ethan did not place restrictions on his own past without reason, and certainly not without leaving a trace of why. Across the city, in a small apartment lit by a single lamp, Lily sat quietly at the edge of a worn couch, watching her son as he slept, his breathing steady, peaceful, untouched by the tension that now surrounded them. And for a moment, her composure softened, her hand brushing gently across his hair as if grounding herself in something real, something unchangeable. But the moment did not last, because she knew time was narrowing. She had seen the way Ethan looked at her, the recognition forming behind his eyes, slow but inevitable, and she understood better than anyone that once he began searching, he would not stop. Earlier that day, she had felt the shift immediately, The subtle repositioning of schedules, the careful proximity, the way his presence appeared just often enough to seem coincidental. And it almost made her smile, because even now, even without remembering, Ethan Caldwell operated the same way, controlled, methodical, always 3 steps ahead, except this time, he was stepping into something he had once chosen to leave behind. She stood up and moved toward the small kitchen, pulling open a drawer where a single folded document rested, worn at the edges from being handled too many times, and for a brief second, she hesitated, her fingers hovering over it, as if questioning whether she was ready for what came next, but then she unfolded it anyway, her eyes scanning the familiar lines, the signatures, the date that connected everything, a quiet confirmation of a truth that no system could erase. Back in his office, Ethan leaned forward, his focus narrowing as he initiated a manual override, bypassing layers of security that had once been placed by his own command. And for the first time since this began, there was resistance, not from external forces, but from something he had set himself, a boundary designed to prevent exactly what he was now attempting. And that realization settled heavily, because it meant one thing he could not ignore. At some point in the past, Ethan Caldwell had known this truth, and he had decided it was better forgotten. The screen flickered briefly before unlocking a restricted archive, and as the first file began to load, Ethan felt that same tension return, sharper than before, because whatever he was about to see was not just information, it was a decision he had already made once. And just as the document opened, just as the first line became visible, his phone vibrated suddenly on the desk, breaking the moment, and when he glanced down, the message was simple, unexpected, and impossible to dismiss. Stop looking, Ethan. You promised you would not come back to this. If I made a promise, there was a reason for it, so why do I not remember making it? Ethan Caldwell said under his breath as he stared at the message on his phone, the words simple but carrying a weight that pressed deeper than anything he had uncovered so far. Because this was no longer about missing data or hidden records. This was direct, intentional, someone reaching into the present to stop him from uncovering the past. And the most unsettling part was not the warning itself, but the familiarity of it, as if some part of him recognized the truth behind those words even while the memory remained just out of reach. He looked back at the screen, the restricted file still open, the first visible line frozen in place like it was waiting for him to acknowledge it, and slowly, deliberately, he set his phone aside, because whatever promise he had made, it had been made by a version of himself who knew something he did not, and that alone was no longer enough to stop him. The file expanded fully now, revealing a structured document, legal, precise, bearing his name in clear authority, and beneath it, a clause that immediately shifted everything. A confidentiality agreement tied not to a corporation, not to a deal, but to an individual. And as his eyes moved across the page, one name appeared, written in full, undeniable, Lily Harper, followed by a second line that made his breath slow. Dependent minor registered under protective status, and then the name of the child. The same name from the report, the same name that carried his own. Ethan leaned back slightly, the pieces beginning to align in a way that felt both inevitable and impossible. Because this was not an accident. This was not coincidence. This was something he had orchestrated himself, a legal structure designed to hide, protect, and distance. And the date confirmed it. 5 years ago, the exact point where his records had become incomplete, where the details had been reduced, where something had been intentionally buried. Across the city, Lily stood by the window of her apartment, her phone still in her hand, the message already sent, knowing it would reach him at exactly the right moment, because she understood his patterns, his timing, the way he approached problems, and even now, even without his memory, he was following the same path, step by step, toward a truth she had once agreed to keep hidden. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself, because what came next was something she had prepared for, but never truly wanted. The moment where distance would no longer be enough, where the past would no longer stay contained within agreements and silence. Back in his office, Ethan scrolled further, each line revealing more than the last. References to relocation, financial provisions, security oversight, all under his direct authorization, all executed with the kind of precision he reserved for matters that mattered most. And yet there was no explanation, no narrative, just actions, decisions, structures, as if he had removed not only the memory but the reasoning behind it, leaving only the outcome intact. "Why would I do this?" he asked quietly, not expecting an answer, but needing to hear the question out loud, because everything about this suggested urgency, necessity, something that required complete separation, not just from the public, but from himself. His gaze returned to the names again: Lily Harper, the child, the shared last name. And this time, instead of confusion, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, a feeling that moved through him not as a memory, but as an echo of one, something familiar in the way her name settled in his mind, something that made her presence by the pool no longer feel random, no longer feel like an intrusion, but like a return. His phone vibrated again. Another message, same unknown number, but this time shorter, sharper. "You are already too late." And Ethan's expression changed, not to fear, not to hesitation, but to something far more dangerous: resolve. Because whatever he had once chosen to forget, whatever promise he had made, it was no longer enough to keep him away from the truth. And if Lily Harper had stepped back into his world now, after 5 years of silence, then this was not something that could remain hidden any longer. It was something that had already begun to unfold. "Being too late only matters if I do nothing," Ethan Caldwell said quietly as he stood up from his desk, the glow of the screen fading behind him, but the weight of what he had just discovered settling deeper into his thoughts. Because now the situation had changed completely. This was no longer a question of who Lily Harper was, but why he had once chosen to hide her and a child connected to his own name, and more importantly, why she had come back now. He moved with purpose, no hesitation, no delay, issuing instructions as he walked, his voice steady but carrying a sharper edge than before. "Prepare the car, no driver, and I want a full live feed on the apartment location." And within minutes, the quiet efficiency of his world adjusted again, systems activating, information flowing. But this time, Ethan was not observing from a distance. He was stepping directly into it. Across the city, Lily felt the shift before she saw it. Not through cameras or messages, but through instinct, the same awareness that had guided her for years, the same quiet signal that told her when something was about to change. And as she stood in the small kitchen, she looked toward the door, her expression calm but resolved, because she knew this moment had been inevitable from the second she stepped back into his world. Her son sat at the table, drawing quietly, unaware of the tension building around them, his small voice breaking the silence as he asked a simple question about something on the page. And Lily knelt beside him, her tone soft, steady, answering him with the same warmth she always did, even as her mind calculated what would happen next. Because whatever truth connected them was no longer contained, it was moving toward confrontation. The black car stopped across the street again. But this time Ethan did not wait. He stepped out immediately, his eyes fixed on the building, his presence sharp, focused, every step measured but direct. And as he reached the entrance, there was no hesitation, no second thought, because the moment for observation had passed. This was the moment for answers. Upstairs, Lily heard the knock. Not loud, not aggressive, but deliberate, controlled, exactly the way she expected, and for a brief second, she closed her eyes, not in fear, but in acceptance, because the distance she had maintained for 5 years had finally collapsed into a single moment. She stood, walked to the door, and opened it without asking who was there, because she already knew. Ethan Caldwell stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes locked onto hers with a clarity that left no room for avoidance. And for the first time since this began, there was no barrier between them, no distance, no controlled environment. Just the truth waiting to be spoken. Neither of them moved immediately, the silence stretching between them, heavy but not empty, filled with everything that had not yet been said. And then Ethan spoke, his voice lower now, more personal. "You knew I would come." And Lily nodded slightly, her gaze steady. "You were always going to," she replied, and that answer carried more than certainty. It carried history. Ethan's eyes shifted briefly past her shoulder, catching a glimpse of the small apartment, the life she had built, simple, contained, and then he saw the child, sitting at the table, looking up with quiet curiosity. And in that instant, something changed, not a memory, not yet, but a recognition that went beyond logic, beyond documents, something instinctive, something undeniable. He stepped inside slowly, not invited but not stopped, his attention returning to Lily as he asked the question that now mattered more than anything else. What did I forget? And Lily held his gaze, her expression softening just enough to reveal the weight she had been carrying alone for years. And when she finally answered, her voice was calm but filled with meaning. You did not forget, Ethan. You chose to leave us behind. I do not walk away from something without a reason, Ethan Caldwell said slowly, his voice steady but carrying a tension that had begun to replace his usual certainty. Because Lily's words did not feel like an accusation. They felt like a truth he had once accepted, and that made them far more dangerous. The room felt smaller now, not because of the space itself, but because of what it contained, the quiet life Lily had built, the child watching from across the room, and the undeniable connection that was no longer just a possibility but something real standing directly in front of him. Ethan took another step inside, his eyes moving briefly to the boy again, noticing the way he observed everything without speaking, the same kind of awareness noted in the report, and this time, the familiarity was stronger, not enough to form a memory, but enough to unsettle his control. If I left, Ethan continued, his gaze returning to Lily, sharper now, searching for any sign that this was something else, something misinterpreted. Then there was something that made staying impossible, and Lily did not respond immediately, not because she did not have an answer, but because she had already lived through the consequences of that answer for 5 years, and she understood that hearing it would not be the same as remembering it. You did not leave because you wanted to, she said finally, her voice calm, but layered with something deeper, something that carried both understanding and quiet disappointment. You left because you believed it was the only way to protect him. Her eyes shifted slightly toward the child, making the meaning unmistakable. And Ethan followed that glance, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly, because protection was not a word he used lightly, not without reason, not without risk. From what? He asked, and this time the question came faster, more direct, because if there had been a threat, if there had been something significant enough to make him erase his own past, then it was something he needed to understand immediately. Lily exhaled softly, not in hesitation, but in preparation, because this was the part she had hoped he would not reach so quickly, the part that would pull everything forward faster than either of them could control. From your world, she said, and Ethan's expression did not change, but something behind it did, because that answer, vague as it was, aligned too easily with everything he knew about the life he had built, the influence, the reach, the quiet enemies that came with power, the kind of risks that were never visible on the surface but always present underneath. That is not specific enough, he replied, his tone firm, but not dismissive, because now he was no longer questioning whether she was telling the truth. He was trying to understand the extent of it. Lily looked at him steadily, no longer holding anything back in her expression, and for the first time, there was no distance between them, no careful control, just honesty shaped by years of silence. 5 years ago, she began, her voice even but deliberate. You found out that someone inside your own circle was leaking information, not business deals, not contracts, but personal data, movements, locations, the kind of information that could be used to pressure you, to control you. And Ethan listened without interruption, because every word fit into a framework he understood too well, a reality he had navigated for years. When you realized what they were really after, she continued, her eyes briefly flicking toward the child again. You made a decision, not as a businessman, but as a father, and that word hung in the air longer than anything else, because it was not just a statement. It was a truth Ethan had no memory of accepting. You moved us out of your life, erased every connection, and made sure even you would not be able to find us unless you chose to break your own system. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, because that was exactly what he had just done. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not uncertain, but loaded with realization, because if what she was saying was true, then everything that had happened since, every step he had taken to uncover this, had been a direct contradiction of a decision he once believed was necessary. And before he could respond, the boy's voice cut gently through the tension, simple, curious, completely unaware of the weight of the moment. "Mom, is he staying?" And Ethan turned toward him fully for the first time. And in that instant, something shifted again, deeper, quieter, not a memory, but something just as powerful, a sense that whatever he had left behind 5 years ago was not gone. It had been waiting, and now it was standing right in front of him. "I do not stay where I do not belong, but I also do not walk away twice," Ethan Caldwell said quietly, his voice lower now, not directed at Lily, not even fully directed at the child, but somewhere in between, as if he was testing the weight of his own words against a truth he was only beginning to understand. The boy's question lingered in the room, simple and unguarded, cutting through layers of silence and history with a clarity that neither Ethan nor Lily could avoid. And for the first time since he stepped inside, Ethan did not respond with control or calculation. He paused, something rare for a man who had built his entire life on immediate decisions. Lily watched him closely, not expecting a perfect answer, not expecting certainty, because she knew what it cost him to even stand here now, to confront something he had once chosen to erase completely. And yet there was a part of her that needed to hear what he would say next, not as a billionaire, not as a strategist, but as the man who had once made a choice that defined all of their lives. Ethan finally looked directly at the boy, his expression softening just enough to reveal something unguarded, something unfamiliar even to himself. "I do not know yet," he said honestly, each word deliberate. "But I am not leaving today." And that answer, incomplete as it was, shifted the atmosphere in a way nothing else had, because it was not a promise, but it was not distance either. It was something in between, something real. The boy nodded slowly, accepting the answer without question, as if he understood more than he showed, and returned to his drawing. Leaving the tension between the adults to unfold on its own, Ethan turned back to Lily, his focus sharpening again. But now it carried something different, not just the need for answers, but the weight of what those answers meant. "If I erased this to protect him," he said, his tone controlled but more personal than before, "then bringing myself back into this changes the risk." And Lily nodded slightly, because that was the truth she had been carrying since the moment she returned, the truth she could not avoid. "It already has," she replied quietly, her eyes steady on his. "The moment you started looking, the system you built started breaking, and if someone was watching before, they will notice now." And Ethan absorbed that without reaction. But inside, the calculation shifted immediately, not away from the truth, but toward it, because if there was still a threat, then ignoring it was no longer protection, it was exposure. "Then why come back?" he asked. And this time there was no edge, no challenge, just a direct need to understand the decision she had made, because everything about her actions suggested intention, not accident. Lily held his gaze, and for the first time, there was no hesitation at all. "Because he asked about you," she said simply, her voice softer now, but carrying more weight than anything she had said before. And Ethan's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that this answer reached somewhere deeper than logic or strategy, somewhere closer to what he had been trying to remember. "He started asking questions I could not answer without you," she continued, her eyes briefly moving toward the child before returning to Ethan. "And I realized that protecting him from your world also meant taking something away from him, something he deserved to know." And the room fell quiet again. But this time it was not filled with tension, it was filled with something heavier, something more personal, because this was no longer just about risk or secrets, it was about choices that affected more than just the two of them. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief moment, as if grounding himself before looking back at her. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was something new beneath it, something that had not been there before. "Then we do not hide anymore." And Lily's expression shifted slightly, not into relief, not into fear, but into something more cautious, because she understood what that meant, not just for them, but for everything that had been kept in place for 5 years. Before she could respond, Ethan's phone vibrated again, sharp, immediate. And when he looked down, the message was no longer a warning, it was a statement, clear and direct. Now we know where they are. And for the first time since this began, Ethan did not feel like he was chasing the truth. He felt like the truth had just found him. If they know where we are, then hiding is no longer protection. It is a delay. Ethan Caldwell said quietly, his eyes still on the message as the weight of it settled into something far more immediate than anything he had faced so far. Because this was no longer about uncovering the past. This was about what was coming next. The room shifted again, not physically, but in the way silence carried urgency now. The kind that does not ask for permission, the kind that demands action, and Ethan lifted his gaze slowly to Lily, who had already understood what the message meant before he even spoke. Her expression calm but no longer guarded, because the moment she had tried to control for 5 years had finally arrived. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steady, not panicked, because she had lived with this possibility from the beginning, and Ethan did not hesitate this time. "Not long enough to wait," he replied, his tone decisive, the clarity returning, but now shaped by something more personal than before, because this was no longer just his problem to solve. This was theirs. The boy looked up again, sensing the shift even without understanding it, his small voice quieter now. "Is something wrong?" And Lily immediately knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, grounding him the way she always had. "No, everything is going to be okay," she said softly, and while the words were meant for him, Ethan heard them too, not as reassurance, but as a promise she had been carrying alone for years. Ethan stepped closer, not to take control of the moment, but to become part of it, his attention moving between them as he spoke. "We are leaving." And Lily looked up at him, searching his expression for hesitation, for doubt, but there was none, only certainty, and something else that had not been there before, responsibility. "Where?" she asked, because location had always been the key, the difference between safety and exposure, and Ethan's answer came without pause. Somewhere that was never written down, and that choice alone confirmed everything she had told him, that even in forgetting, he had prepared for this. He had built contingencies not just for business, but for them. Within minutes, the quiet apartment transformed into movement, small but precise, essentials gathered, nothing unnecessary, because this was not an escape. This was a transition, and as Lily packed, Ethan moved through the space with a focus that felt instinctive, checking entry points, timing, distance, not as a stranger, but as someone who had done this before, even if he did not remember it. When they stepped outside, the air felt different, heavier, charged with something unseen, and Ethan opened the car door, guiding them in with a calm that masked the speed of his thoughts, because now every decision mattered in ways that extended beyond himself. As the car pulled away, Lily looked back once, not at the building, but at the life they were leaving behind, the 5 years of distance, of silence, of protection, and then she turned forward again, because whatever came next would not allow for hesitation. Ethan drove without speaking for a moment, his focus on the road, but his mind already moving ahead, mapping possibilities, calculating risks, until finally, he said something that shifted everything again. "There is more you have not told me." And Lily did not deny it, did not deflect, because there was no point anymore. "Yes," she answered quietly, and Ethan glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Then tell me now," he said, and Lily hesitated, not out of fear, but because this was the truth she had held back the longest, the one that changed everything not just for him, but for what came next. She took a breath, steadying herself, and then she spoke, her voice calm but carrying a weight that could not be undone. "The person who was watching you 5 years ago, it was not just someone in your circle," she said, and Ethan felt that familiar tension return, sharper than ever. "It was someone you trusted enough to let them close to us." And for the first time since this began, Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, not in panic, but in recognition of what that implied. And before he could ask the next question, Lily finished the sentence that changed everything. "And they already know you came back for us."